What's going on, everyone? It is that time. Yes, we've got a brand new tier list. Way too early for the set 4 leaders. This is going to be a fun one, and I've got a lot to talk about. Of course, we are still getting set 4 cards, or as of at least recording this video, we are still seeing spoilers. We have all 18 leaders, but there are still more things that could change the perception of these leaders. There's not consistent decks. There's still a bunch of testing that needs to be done between the previous sets and this set, etc., etc., etc. But this is going to be very, very, very initial first impressions about these leaders, and of course, kind of how I felt playing each and every one of these, because I have played every single leader on this list at least a couple of times so far, and well, there are certainly ones that feel better initially than others. I want to say a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. I know a lot of you were questioning when I was going to come out with this video, and here we are. So hopefully you all enjoy this, and thank you. And also I have a TCG player link in the description down below if you want to pick up any of these set 4 leaders. But we're going to be ranking them from, well, best to worst here, starting off with the Vigilance leaders. Of course, the S tier to D tier are just going to be in relation to the leaders on this list. You could have a D tier leader that's, well, maybe not D tier overall, and we're going to be doing those videos soon. But just take this with a grain of salt. It's a lot more fun, and it's a lot more just initial impressions. I am 100% expected to be wrong on some of these, but again, test for yourself, and let's dive into it. Starting us off in the Vigilance category, we have Rose Tico. Rose Tico's got an interesting ability to go ahead and heal some of those vehicle units that are attacking. She does flip as a 5 resource 4/6, which is actually not bad at all. And she has that same ability, but as an on attack trigger on the flip side. So first off, vehicles are pretty prominent as of like set 4 cards in general. There's a lot of space units. There's a lot of like random indirect damage flying around. There's like pings from Luke or Django decks or Cad Bane decks. But here's the thing with Rose Tico. Okay, I have played a few matches of Rose Tico. The 4/6 body is fantastic. Honestly, it's the best thing about Rose Tico. And I've said that about some other leaders as well. 4/6 body, not too bad. I honestly think she goes somewhere around like low B tier, C tier for me here. The healing can be sometimes relevant. Realistically, you're healing 1 damage. The unfortunate part about this is that you can't go ahead and kind of divvy up this heal across multiple vehicle units, and you do actually have to attack with a vehicle unit in order to get that heal. One of the most impactful things oftentimes is that early game Tarkin Town usage, and this oftentimes doesn't prevent that. So the advantage of healing, like for example, from Obi-Wan isn't really there because you cannot prevent that strategy from taking place. So that's a little bit unfortunate. And also oftentimes you aren't going to be able to heal things because your unit would have already died because your opponent's expecting the heal to come from Rose Tico. Another odd thing I noticed when playing with Rose Tico is a lot of the other decks that are encouraging pilot synergies or vehicle synergies can be deployed as a pilot, and Rose can't, which is kind of a negative towards her. Honestly, she's just a 4/6 body for 5, which is fine. There's a little bit of value with the healing from vehicles, or healing for vehicles rather, but nothing too strong to write home about. She's going to get a low B tier for me. Next up, we've got Lando. Lando, huh? We've got another Vigilance Heroism leader here. This is the second one of the group. He deploys for 7 resources. 7 resources, okay? He's got this action to pay 1, and you can play a unit from your hand. If you do, and you control both ground and space, you can go ahead and give a shield token to a unit. Now, remember, you play a unit from your hand by paying the extra cost, and you're able to go ahead and get that shield token if that unit fulfills the arena that you don't have fulfilled already. So if you have a ground unit and you're playing that space unit, you suddenly get to put a shield token on something. First off, this costs 1 resource. So it's kind of similar to a Luke ability where it already wasn't extremely strong. We saw Luke, we saw how powerful the shield tokens were. I'd say they're a little bit less strong nowadays, especially with all the random like upgrade hate Again, random units defeat tokens, or random units will move shield tokens around, or things like that happen. So these are less valuable with set 4 is what I found out. Add to the fact that he deploys for 7. This to me is like a D tier, maybe C tier. The added cost and the fact that you have to have a unit in each arena is pretty weak, especially when you're playing a deck that's focusing on pilots, which you kind of want to when your leader is a pilot option. And also, if you're going into space and you're going into ground, you're oftentimes weaker in both. Now, sometimes you just need to divvy up your presence because your opponents are going into one arena or what the other. But you usually want to be hard focusing into one if you actually can, because that gives you domination to the point where you can actually take advantage of that and really push your advantage, as far as I've seen with set 4. And Lando doesn't really do that. He deploys for 7. You can have a Sentinel. Great. 7 is too late in the game. It's just too late in the game. Games don't even last that long oftentimes. And if they are, you're getting pieted or something nasty is happening, and you're not going to be winning with a Lando deploy, okay? He is not strong. 7 to deploy is just too late. And most leaders that are deploying that late, as you've seen, are just either not strong or they've got to be some sort of late game deck. And unfortunately, Heroism Vigilance isn't really the place to be late game deck. You kind of got to be in villainy for the most part. So Lando going to get a D tier. But then we move on to the villainy Vigilance leaders. Starting us off with Asajj. This one's been pretty interesting. Honestly, I kind of was not impressed with Asajj as we were first learning about her, but as I've played more and more, she's kind of gone up a little bit, and I may adjust these as we continue on with the list. But Asajj, I think she ends up maybe a high B tier, or maybe at most a low A tier, but I think like somewhere around the high B tier to mid B tier range is more likely. She has this interesting ability to go ahead and kind of exchange damage, right? 1 to your unit, 1 to a friendly unit, 1 to enemy unit after dealing 1 to a friendly unit. The biggest restriction with this is that you have to have that unit in the same arena, but it's really strong with something like Tarkin Town, right? Turn 1, you play an Inferno 4, your opponent plays A wing, whatever, Y wing, whatever they play in the space arena, and you get to kill their turn 1 unit. That's actually really strong, as we see with like Cad Banes and Quinlins and things like that. She deploys for 6, which is reasonably late, but she does give grit, and she can go ahead and do that whole thing where you're dealing 1 to your own unit and dealing another damage to an opposing unit in the same arena. So that grit can stack up decently quickly. And when you do deploy that pilot option onto a vehicle unit, it does get a little bit scary with that grit. It does pump up really quickly, and it does do some crazy things. I'll say this, there are a few specific units that I really like with Asajj. One of them being like Devastating Gunship. That card was already pretty good in like a Kira deck. This one just kind of gives you some free value by you play your Devastating Gunship, you kill something, you get some extra value by pinging your own Devastating Gunship, and pinging their unit can get rid of shield tokens and kind of whittle down some other units. But I think the Tarkin Town and playing a little bit more of I wouldn't say an aggressive deck, but like a more mid-rangey deck where you do have some removal options and you do get to the Asajj flip and you do use her as that grit powerhouse. I think there's some value there, and so that's kind of what I've seen with it. Tarkin Town really was what makes this deck interesting to me. But then we got probably the one people are most excited about, Thrawn. And honestly, I was pretty excited about him as well. I've played a good amount of Thrawn. It was really cool. I don't think he's that strong. I think he fits somewhere on the mid B tier range. I actually find him weaker on average than Asajj, just because of Asajj's synergies with Tarkin Town. That's just literally it, especially with aggro meta that set 3 has been. And that's what we tend to see with set 4. I prefer Asajj's early game strength with Tarkin Town. Thrawn is cool, and there are some really specific things that are good with him, like Krennic and playing the when defeated things, right? But you can kind of do that in Asajj anyways. The value of Thrawn comes from actually using his when defeated additional when defeated trigger. And there's just not that many when defeated triggers in the game. That's just the unfortunate situation of it. The best one, honestly, in Thrawn, like at a average rate, is Ruthless Raider. You bring Ruthless Raider down, you get the 2 damage, it dies, you get another 2 damage, and then you get to trigger it again, which is really, really strong. You get 4 damage, essentially divided as you choose amongst 2 targets. Or rather 2 damage to one, 2 damage to another if you want, and then of course 4 damage to their base, which has been pretty nice. There's some really okay and I say okay as in like literally just okay, early units that work with Thrawn. Things like the Onyx Squadron Brute, I believe it's called, the one that heals, and then you have the Inferno 4s and things like that that come down early that are not bad. But to be honest, there's nothing been impressive with Thrawn. There's no when defeated trigger that I really like that absolutely dominates the game. There's not enough of the early game potential with Thrawn. Like, oh, I'm playing another unit and it's really, really solid, into another unit that's really, really solid. And as soon as I kill these, I'm getting value from Thrawn every single turn. It's just not like that. You're just not getting value from Thrawn every single turn, unfortunately. There are two different versions. I've seen it, Thrawn Red and Thrawn Green. Thrawn Red, I think, is a little bit stronger because you do get that Ruthless Raider, and you do get a few other things that are really nice, like the Droid Gunship, the 3 cost one that gives you the 3 indirect damage when it's defeated. Dealing 6 indirect damage is a lot, and you can play a little bit more of a mid-range deck. Green is interesting because you get like Cobb Vanth and things like that, which is kind of fun, but nothing super strong. And every single time I find a Thrawn deck, I'm just like, okay, I guess. Like, you could play Ruthless Raider, but I'd rather just play it in Piet. Like, that's the type of situation that I find myself in. Not to mention he deploys for 6, and he's a 4/7, which is like reasonable, nothing too crazy. He can't pilot. It's literally all about these when defeated abilities, and unfortunately, there's just not enough of them to make Thrawn good. I think this is one of those leaders that is most likely to improve. Out of any leader on this list, I think Thrawn has the most potential for improvement. And that's what I mentioned when I saw Thrawn release. Really, really cool idea as of right now in set 4, before we get more cards revealed. Because the last card that I saw that was revealed was kind of like that 30 plus card video that I did. So as of recording that video, that's where you can kind of see where my man set was. But I don't think we're going to get enough cards to make Thrawn be like insane. But we'll see. With that said, we move on to our command leaders. Starting us off with Admiral Holdo. Very, very interesting one. I'm going to have to put her in the seat here. Here's the thing with her. When you're playing like command heroism, you oftentimes are pairing it with something that could just be played that's better, right? You're playing aggression because you want more resistance options like Black 1, for example, and Poe Dameron. Well, I'd rather just play Sabine. Like, it's so much better. So much better. Or you could play Luke Green or Wedge Red or like just so many different other options. And the only thing she works with is resistance cards. And there's not a crazy amount of them. Obviously, Poe Dameron as the new version of Poe Dameron and the old version of Poe Dameron are great. You have Black 1, which is a new one. You have a couple of Resistance X-Wings. Like, you have a couple of resistance cards that do work reasonably well. But remember, all she's doing is you get to pay 1 resource for potentially like a breaking in sort of situation. And that's assuming you get to attack with it because there's no guarantee. And that's assuming it's a resistance unit. And all that kind of just assumes a lot of different things, right? There's not enough resistance units to build a solid, like, you're going to have to play bad cards in your deck to actually have a guaranteed resistance unit at every point. And on top of that, if you're going and kind of leveraging your resistance units, you lose the leveraging of rebel units, which is, way better. Like, you have A wings and Y wings, which are oftentimes just better units. You have the fleet lieutenants, and you have the wing leaders, which are just better options. Rebel assault, which is oftentimes just better. Like, you just have better things with rebels to where you're actually like making your deck worse if you're playing the resistance cards and then kind of leaning into them for Holdo's purposes. She does flip for 6 resources, which is, as a 3/8, which is whatever. Like, it is what it is. It's not strong. It's not aggressive, which is oftentimes what heroism wants to be here in this situation. You can go ahead and give resistance units the +2/+2. The nice thing about it is there are resistance upgrades that float around, and there are a few of those. You have things like BB-8, for example, or like the Poe Dameron. So you do have a few resistance upgrades. So you can play rebel units with resistance upgrades, but there's just so many specific things that needs to happen. And it still costs you a resource and 2 actions to get the +2/+2. And oftentimes that's just not strong enough. Like, the fact that you can't immediately attack is just too weak. If you could immediately attack, that's something that, could be interesting to me. But again, 1 resource, can't immediately attack. It's just not really something that you're going to be doing in the game until a little bit later on, as far as I have seen. And then, of course, if you're a little bit later on in the mid game, well, your leader deploy is going to be a little bit weaker than theirs. And if your opponent is playing like a control deck, oh my gosh, you're just completely screwed, because they're going to kill your resistance units if you have them, and if you don't have enough, then they're going to kill your units with upgrades on it, and you still can't use Holdo. So yeah, I don't think Holdo's that particularly strong, but I think that was expected because there's just not enough resistance units and resistance upgrades, and the resistance synergies aren't quite there yet. But that moves us into the next one, which we've got Darth Vader for. This one I've had a good amount of fun with. This is definitely one of those leaders that heavily relies on initiative. If you have initiative, he might be an A tier. If you don't have initiative, he might be a C tier. And so for that, I'm actually going to put him somewhere in like the B tier. I don't know if he's better than Asajj or not, honestly. He's interesting. One of the things with Darth Vader is you really, really want to be using his action every turn. If you can't, like, let's say you don't have the initiative. Turn 1, you play a space unit. Turn 1, they play a space unit. And then turn 2, they kill your space unit and maybe leave their space unit alive, because that's what will happen in Darth Vader a lot. You are feeling horrible because you now have a leader that does absolutely nothing until 6 resources. Like, that's just what the game feels like. And it's very consistent, especially with things like blue leaders, Tarkin Towns, things like that. It is tricky in the meta to be able to use this action every single time. If you do have initiative and you're able to use the TIE Fighter trigger and you're able to get some value from that, you play like Darth Vader Red, and then you can Tarkin Town away their unit and kind of battle it out for the early game. And then to the point where you have a bunch of these space units, and then you can deploy Darth Vader, and then you're just kind of whittling people down. That can be kind of interesting. But remember, each TIE Fighter that you create requires an action as well, and that can be a little bit tricky. The thing that I've seen that's best with Darth Vader is just the fact that you get a big old beefy space unit that you are guaranteed to have because of all the TIE Fighters you have on the board. And then you have the combination of command villainy and aggression villainy, which is a strong combination with things like Overwhelming Barrage, Tarkin Town, Ruthless Raiders, things like that. But honestly, this feels like another one where I don't know if it's really that powerful when you compare to other options that you have. Speaking of, that moves us to the next one, which is Piet. Piet has been one of the stronger ones. This was one that I think a lot of people are interested in, and I found some pretty strong things to do with Piet. The question is, which way to play him, and is he S tier? I'm going to go on a limb here and say that he is one of the better leaders from this set, and he really depends on kind of where the meta is going to be at. I think this has some high potential. I'm going to put him in the S tier. I think Piet's actually really, really solid. Here's the thing with Piet. I've seen a lot of people kind of try to build Piet as a normal deck. I think what you have to do is lean into kind of being a soft control deck that just wins the game on like turn 6, turn 5, turn 6. You deploy these massive space units that people just can't deal with. Right? Early game, you go with your open fires. You have a little bit of ramp if that works. And then you just play your Devastator into Devastator, like the new Devastator into the old Devastator. And you just completely wipe the board. You got planetary bombardments, things like that. You have a few early units like Ruthless Raider and Resupply Carrier that aren't early, but in Piet, they can be played with 1 resource discount. And that is extremely strong. So that can be really, really quite interesting. But the only thing that you're really doing is kind of playing like a villainy command vigilance or villainy command aggression soft control deck, and that's already good, but then you just get this massive discount to the point where you are oftentimes, turn 1 taking initiative or killing their unit, turn 2 you're ramping, turn 3 you are deploying Piet and probably deploying Ruthless Raider, which is killing one of their units, or ramping even further with like something like Resupply Carrier, which puts you up to 6 resources. The following turn, you're playing Devastators. Like, that's pretty good. Like the new Devastator that also kills units, right? Or if you don't even have Devastator, you play a Planetary Bombardment, right? And it's 12 indirect damage. You could probably just close out the game with something like that. Like, it's just crazy, right? And so I've seen that happen numerous amounts of times in Piet, and it's really strong. And I think there's some potential in Vigilance as well with Colossus. The 35 HP base really helps you out with getting to Avengers and things like that, which is what you want to be doing with Piet, right? And you still have Devastators, you still have Resupply Carriers, which are all really, really good. So I think there's a lot of potential you have with Piet. I think Vigilance and Aggression and even Cunning, they're all options. And the fact that, like, when I'm playing Asajj, I haven't really found a strength in Cunning Asajj or Command Asajj, or I haven't found strength in Cunning Thrawn, or, you know, anything outside of like Rose Tico, or like there's specific combinations for a lot of these decks. Whereas Piet, I feel like there's like 3 very solid decks. With Triple Dark Raid and Cunning, you have the Aggression with the new Devastator, and you have Vigilance with Colossus and the new capital ships. It's just, you have a lot of potential with Piet, and I think he is warranting an S tier in terms of the potential, and at least in terms of what he's able to do. He's one of those ones, though, if it's really aggressive meta, like Sabine Green type meta, you're going to struggle a little bit, because while, yes, you're ramping, you could just be dead by the time you actually get your thing on board. Although, if you are able to get down an early Devastator into a Planetary Bombardment, that can really wipe the board, and that could be strong as well. So, I don't know. Next up, we've got Wedge, and this is one that I have had a lot of fun with, and I'm sure you all have seen a lot of Wedge. This is one of my personal favorites. I think at minimum, I would put him in A tier. But it's interesting because we have a lot of leaders here, and I think it really depends on kind of what you are doing. But one of the things with Wedge is a lot of the upgrade-based decks, you really struggle in some of the more controlling matchups. Because of Chewbacca, Wedge really solves that issue, especially because you can play him for 2 resources. Add to the fact that with Wedge, you can get down early pilots and you have the red leader to potentially create multiple space units. Add to the fact on all that you have some really nice additions from the new set. I think Wedge actually ends up in S tier. I think that Piet has a little bit more potential than Wedge, but the fact that you're getting such amounts of discounts every single turn with Wedge makes it so that you have a lot of potential, and makes it so that he's a really strong aggro deck to contend with. And one of the strongest things that you can do is, like, turn 1, play a space unit. Let's say just like a space unit like Cartel Turncoat plus Wolfpack Escort, or you play an A-Wing. If you're playing Aggression, you just put any pilot on it. Oftentimes, that's good enough to not be Tarkin Town away, which is important. But then also, you just start getting in some damage. Turn 2, you play a Millennium Falcon. If your opponent doesn't deal with it immediately, you put a Chewbacca and another pilot on it, and you're smacking for like 12 damage. Like, just straight up 12 damage. 4 resources. You're on turn 3. You've deployed your Millennium Falcon last turn. You win on turn 3. It's possible. It's happened. I've done it multiple times. But you just have so much potential with the explosiveness of Wedge that I think there's a lot of things there going for it. Now, again, there is a little bit of one-tricking with Wedge, where you do kind of need some space units early on. And so it really depends on kind of what deck you're fighting and how the meta shapes up. If there's a ton of Tarkin Towns, I think you still have potential, but it does get a little bit weaker. And that's where I would consider maybe like A tier. But with the expectation that we're going to get a few more space units, and we've already seen things like Fireball, for example, I think there is a lot of potential for Wedge. And on top of all that, the fact that you can have like Cunning Wedge and have an immediately readied up Millennium Falcon that smacks for 1,000,000 points of damage because of Wedge discounting some of those pilots. So you can go on turn 4 when Wedge comes down, you can like put Millennium Falcon down, put a Wedge on him, and 6 readied up damage immediately. Granted, you could always deploy Wedge, but then you could also do things like Millennium Falcon, put a Chewbacca on Millennium Falcon. That's now a 6/7. You attack for 6, immediately readied up, and deploy Wedge, and you get in for 3. That's 9 damage immediately. That's oftentimes a third of opponent's bases. That's pretty nice, right? And you've already done a lot of damage up until that point. So I think there's a lot of potential for Wedge in terms of just how aggressive he can be. And it's one of those things where I think it leans more towards like Kylo Ren over like a Sabine. But I guess we'll see how strong it ends up being in the future. Next up, we've got the Aggression leaders, and there are 5 of them because one of our starter decks is an Aggression leader. So first up, we've got Major Vonreg, and this is the last one we actually saw in terms of leaders, but the first one that we get to saw, the first one that we saw, but the last one that was revealed, because it was kind of just like the image of him was shown at the very beginning of Set 4 spoilers. but he's actually pretty good. He's a 4 deploy leader, and immediately you're like, oh, 4 to deploy? What does he do? Right? Because that's really aggressive. I'm actually going to put him somewhere in the A tier because in my initial experience with Major Von Rag, he's just a really nice aggro leader. And he's got this action similar to Boba Fett Daimyo where you play your units and you pump up your other units that are already on the board. And that's really, really nice to get in just a couple points of damage here and there, right? That's all you really need. He comes down 2/5 body or +3/+3. And on attack with that unit, give another unit +1/+0. That's pretty good. That's potential for 4 damage on an aggressive leader like that. And it's really not that hard to get him down. Not to mention, he makes that space unit or vehicle a leader unit, which is way harder to remove. It also gives it +3/+3, so it's not able to be takedown oftentimes. It just makes it so that you are much more consistently able to get in a bunch of damage. And this is one of those things where I think just playing like an aggression, villainy, space oriented deck, you could definitely play like a triple dark raid, sort of like a Django deck, but instead of, going into like all the indirect or the pings and things like that, you can kind of just play like what old set 1 Boba Red was, which was just more of an aggressive triple dark raid, play your space units, get in damage. And I think that's exactly where Major Von Reg fits. That's where I've played him, at least aggression, cutting, villainy. I think is really, really quite strong. You can also play double aggression villainy, which is kind of interesting because you get to play aggression itself, which I think is a decently strong option as well, especially in this meta. But I think most often it's just going ahead and playing this as aggression, cunning, triple dark raid space tech is just good. It's just strong. You get a lot of options. And heck, you get a +3/+3, slapping that on like a TIE Phantom. Whew. That's so common. Turn 2, you play a TIE Phantom. Turn 3, just slap Major Von Rag. Boom, it's a 5/5, can't be defeated. It's nasty. It's nasty, guys. It's pretty good. Okay? It's pretty good. Next up, we've got Poe Dameron, which is another one that I was pretty excited about. It is 1 to deploy leader, essentially, but we have a leader that has an action to pay 1 to make it an upgrade that's +2/+1, right? A pilot upgrade that's +2/+1, or you can deploy him for 5, and that's an epic action, by the way. And this gives you a 4/6 body, which is actually pretty good, and then you can attach him to a friendly vehicle unit as a pilot. So this guy's actually been pretty good, and I'm going to put him in the A tier. Whether he's above Major Von Reg, I'm not sure, but I found Poe Dameron pretty good. This is one of those cool things with the new set where because of these actions where you're able to flip the leader back and forth, you can actually have Poe Dameron down on the battlefield multiple times in a game, right? And one of the cool synergies with Poe Dameron is obviously Poe Dameron Command. We all saw this where you're able to play like Black 1 on turn 1. You flip Poe Dameron into an upgrade on turn 2, and then you eject him out of that vehicle to where he's a 4/6 body on turn 2, and you got to get an attack in that unit, right? Which is really, really important. And I think that's really the best thing about Poe Dameron is he's not quite as like all in on the aggressive strategy as Wedge. It's a little bit more value oriented, surprisingly, because you're able to constantly reapply him, because once he dies, or if that vehicle dies with him on it, he goes back to the leader zone and you're able to flip him over again, assuming he's not exhausted, right? Where when he dies or when the upgrade dies, it goes back to the leader zone exhausted. But once the next round comes, you can redeploy him out there. And you can actually do something pretty cool where this action on the leader side does not require you to exhaust him. So you can actually deploy him as a leader, attack him for 4, and then equip him to one of your, or move him over to one of your vehicles and get it in for another 2 points of damage, which is actually pretty good. So pretty nice there. He's also a resistance unit, so he works with BB-8, which is nice because I found BB-8 to be pretty good. So you could definitely do things like that where you have Poe Dameron, you inject him onto the ground, you've gone ahead and basically flipped Poe Dameron into that leader with eject, you attack in with him, you BB-8 something else, you ready up Poe Dameron again, you attack. Let's say Poe Dameron dies, you can actually epic action out him again for free, so you could potentially get in for like 12 damage in a single turn. There's some really cool things you can do. All that noted, he is literally just an upgrade. And so he does not necessarily provide additional board presence or control over the game, and that's the downside to him. That's why I can't put him in S tier. So he can do some really cool things and pump up your units. But if your opponent has turn 2 Power of the Dark Side, like, your guy's not doing anything, you know? Now you can play Chewbacca's in this deck as well, but it's not quite as good as something like Wedge, where you can get a discount on it. For example, there's no like extra pings in or something like that that can help you control the board. It's all about just pumping up that space unit or those space units, which can be decent. But he is quite strong, and honestly, I think there's an argument for him to be above Major Von Reg or maybe even S tier. I think there's some really cool things you can do with Poe Dameron. So definitely don't write him off. And well, I hope to see more cards that work with him. Eject is a very, very sweet one. Next up, we've got Luke Skywalker. This one's a pretty nice one in aggression, heroism as well. We have a action, make it so that if you attack with a fighter unit, you just deal 1 damage to a unit. Pretty straightforward. That's really strong, to be honest. You get a lot of pings with this guy across the game. It's really important to note that you just have to attack with a fighter unit. And the tokens are fighters. The ambushers are also fighters oftentimes in this deck. So if you ambush out, even if you don't have a space unit to attack with, that works. And he just really does work at controlling the game to where you actually can get to a Luke deployment, and he just completely wipes the board in terms of being able to get some value done. Now, I'm not actually sure. Again, he is A tier for me. I'm not actually sure. Oh, this one's really tricky. I think all 3 of these are really close, and I wouldn't blame anyone for swapping them around in the A tier category. But I'm actually going to put Luke at the top of the A tier, at least in terms of my experience. One of the cards that works really well with him is Blue Leader, but you have so many different options. I tend to lean towards Luke Command. No ECL, because I don't think the space units are necessary to have, or you don't need ECL to make your space units like ambush. It's just not really applicable all that often, and oftentimes the 5 HP is a little bit more valuable in Luke, but you absolutely can to make sure that you trigger Luke's ability even more. Cards like Red 5 are amazing because you can go ahead and finish off units, but you basically have a similar pilot type deck with your pilots, with your space units, like Poe Dameron and like Wedge. The thing with this one is initiative also really changes some of the matchups, similar to how Darth Vader works. If you always had initiative, this would be S tier. If you don't have initiative, it's more like low A tier in some matchups, right? So that could really change things, especially with things like Y-Wing and A-Wing on your list. There is some cool lists with like double aggression Luke that I've seen, but I lean towards command aggression Luke. So just a little bit of value here and there. It's also important to note that you can actually hit ground units with this ping, and that does come in relevant a lot of the time. So just keep that in mind when you are fighting against Luke or fighting as Luke. I mean, you just get a lot of value from this and being able to punch up on things that otherwise would have been really devastating for you because of that extra damage ping from Luke. Next up, we've got Captain Phasma. Phasma. I don't know, guys. Phasma. I was excited about her because obviously if you have first order units like you have rebels, this is just like a better Sabine, right? Because you just get 1 damage every single turn in terms of frontside action. But there's no first order units. There's like no first order units. The best one being the new Pride, which gives you the indirect damage trigger on attack. I guess Kylo Ren's good, but that was an expensive unit. It's not really going to give you what you're looking for in a Phasma deck. The cards that you have access to that are first order just aren't that strong or aren't that consistent. They're not the best options you have. And for that reason, I'm going to have to put her in the C tier. Phasma she is a 5 to deploy 4/5, which is on the weaker side as well. And even if you do play those first orders with her and you start to get some damage pings in, you just don't have that many first order to play. Like if you play Command Aggression Phasma, which is the one I tried, you have so few first order units to play on curve. And a lot of them you don't want to be playing in your deck, right? Like TIE Dagger. You don't want to be playing that in your deck. You're not going to have oftentimes damage on your opponent's units to trigger the ability. And it's just a 2/2 when you're trying to play a more aggressive deck. Or Sith Trooper, it's a 3 resource 3/3, and in some cases like a 4/3 or 5/3. Like you just don't want to be playing these cards. There's a couple decent turn 1 plays, but you don't really want to be doing one drop things, right? Like the TIE Fighter or the Stormtrooper. Like they're all weaker units, and there's no like wing leaders or fleet lieutenants that are just making me like, oh my gosh, I gotta play First Order for that card. Like when you play Rebels, you're like, I need to play Rebels because I have Fleet Lieutenant on turn 2. I have Wing Leader on turn 2. And these are insane cards. Fast just doesn't have them. And lastly, for the aggression category, we've got Boba Fett. And this one's pretty strong. I have been reasonably impressed with Boba Fett. I'm actually going to put him in the A tier. But on the lower end of things, the indirect damage just really adds up. And you can really find yourself in a really nice position with Boba Fett. I generally lean towards Triple Dark Raid, Command, or Cunning, Aggression, Villainy, Boba Fett, similar to how I play Major Vonreg, but Boba Fett's a little bit different because you play a lot of different units. You're playing a lot of units that are specifically good with Boba Fett, a lot of these indirect damage units, a lot of these things that kind of just get some value here and there. Things like the Fett's Fire Spray for 4 resources, it comes down and it's basically like 4 resource, 4 space unit, which is already like decently oftentimes above curve in space. And even like on curve to some of the ground units you're seeing. So you get in for 4, but then you also get the when play trigger of 2 indirect damage, and you get the on attack trigger of 2 indirect damage, which is oftentimes 4 to their base because they can't take it to their units because they've already been taking damage to their units. And if you like Triple Dark Raid that thing out, yes, you can hit your Ruthless Raiders, but there's nothing wrong with Triple Dark Raiding Fett's Fire Spray out and then just like 4 indirect damage plus the attack with Boba Fett's Fire Spray. It just really adds up very, very quickly. And there's a lot of units that work well with Boba Fett, with a few things being revealed. And mind you, if you do any sort of non-combat damage, you're able to go ahead and get this trigger off. So if you have like Daring Raids, for example, you kill a space unit, you can always trigger Boba Fett after that. And that's pretty strong as well. I've been really impressed with Boba Fett in terms of indirect damage. It's definitely the best indirect damage deck that I've seen, which makes sense. It's kind of the face of indirect damage. But yeah, I mean, it's just solid. It's just a solid option. Not to mention the fact that when you are playing that Boba Fett, which, well, you oftentimes will be as a pilot, you do get like that mini overwhelming barrage, which is perfect because your opponent has to think about that when they're divvying up that indirect damage. And that +4/+4, especially on like an immediately readied up Fett's Fire Spray 6 resource version, ooh, that can be a game ender. That's 9 damage, guys. That's 9 damage. That is insane. That's incredibly powerful. And that's not including all the other damage that you can get up ready immediately with like Triple Dark Raid. So I think all those things add up and really make Boba Fett a scary leader. Lastly, for our tier list, we've got the Cunning options. And this is where it gets a little bit, well, I don't want to say like disappointing, but probably just a little bit disappointing. Really starting us off, we've got Admiral Trench. Now this is the one that I think it's interesting, but I don't find it to be particularly strong. So Admiral Trench, you have this hand filter in the early stages of the game. And then as you get deeper into the game, you can go ahead and flip him for 3 resources. Now, mind you, this is not an epic action. And there's no epic action attached to this guy, which means that you cannot flip him for free. You must pay 3 resources. There's no option to have this, oh, I'm going to get so many resources. He's more of a value engine. You flip him for 3 resources, you get a 4/5. Okay, not bad, but you can only do it on 6 resources. So by that point, a 4/5 doesn't really do a whole lot. You kind of get this, for those of you that play Magic, like a fact or fiction effect where you reveal a top 4, your opponent chooses half of them, you draw one of the other half, and that's pretty interesting, I guess. You get to draw a card. It's paying 3 resources to get a 4/5, draw a card. Draw your worst, or I guess, yeah, your like best card of the worst half of the top 4 of your deck, which is pretty mediocre. The best thing I've seen with this is he's a separatist, so you can work with the new space unit that I talked about in my previous video, where you get a 1 resource discount, but I'd rather just play Count Dooku. I just don't really see what Trench is trying to accomplish here. The hand filtering is just not good enough. The separatist synergies are just not good enough. And if you are, I'd rather play Dooku. I'm just not that high on Trench. And I know we have some Trench enjoyers out there. And, you know, I'm a little bit of a trench enjoyer with the Clone Wars series and all that, so I can respect that, but not that strong looking for me. So I'm gonna have to put him. Is he a D tier? Yeah, I'm gonna put him in D tier, guys. I'm sorry. I would put him in D tier. Next up, we've got Rio Durant. This one's been a little bit interesting one because he is also a pretty aggressive space leader. Again, you can play him like Cunning, Aggression, Villainy, which is what Boba Fett and Major Von Reg are doing. I actually have found, and I fought against this a couple times, double Cunning Rio Durant is pretty good. There's enough space units to support it, and there's a lot of transports in general in Cunning anyways. So there's a lot of space units that you can support the Rio Durant. The thing about this action, it's kind of similar to the Holdo. I shouldn't even say that. It's not similar at all. The idea of paying 1 resource to get extra value for an attack is the same as Holdo. But here's the big difference with Rio. You immediately get to attack with that unit. That's huge. You get +1/+0, so you don't get as much power, but the toughness oftentimes doesn't matter because your unit would have already died, or your unit will die at the end of the phase. So the fact that you just get to immediately attack with it makes the toughness kind of irrelevant. And you get Saboteur, and that's really important because that gives you the ability to cut through some of those sentinels or shielded units. I think that's actually pretty good. So his action is significantly more versatile and useful than I've found than something like, for example, Holdos. But what's really interesting about him is that he deploys also. So he's got this like decent ability that can be used every once in a while, get through those sentinels and things like that. But he deploys on one of your transports as a pilot. It gives you +4/+5 in Saboteur for 5 resources. That's a lot of power, right? 4 power is a good amount for an aggressive deck on 5 resources. So that ends up being really obnoxious and it can really close out a game. So the fact that he's Cunning, the fact that you can play the Cunning Villainy stuff and all that good stuff, and you can play double Cunning potentially with Triple Dark Raid and all that, it's really, really quite powerful. Cunning is an exceptionally powerful card. Who knew? We did. And the fact that you can play him and not harm like your Triple Dark Raid deck or anything like that, and you can play Triple Dark Raid in the vehicle deck, like all that stuff works together. Rio Durant's actually a really solid one. Not anything too crazy, but I would definitely put him in like B tier. I found him to be decent, and that's where I'll put him, in the B tier. Next up, we've got Admiral Akbar, and I know you all have seen double Cutting Admiral Akbar from me. I think it might be the best way to play Akbar. I don't know. I played Command Akbar. I played double Cutting Akbar with Palpatine. I mentioned this in that video, but I don't think he's particularly amazing, even in the context of set 4 leaders. I would have to put him somewhere in the C tier, probably at the top above Holdo and Phasma, but I just think that he is not quite that strong. And I'm actually going to put him lower than Rose Tico, even though that might sound odd, because Rose Tico is a 5 to deploy 4/6. Straight up, that's all. Right? That's all she needs. Yes, there's a little bit of action, but what I found with Akbar is this exhaust, pay 1 resource to exhaust, is a lot of dirtling and a lot of effort and really not gain that much value. There is some select scenarios where your opponent has this massive piloted up space unit, you can exhaust it with Akbar, and you're like, dang, that's sweet. But then he also deploys on 6 resources as a 3/8. And if you're dirtling and trying to create all these X-Wings and swarm down your opponent, it's just a little bit too late for him to come down and not have enough power to actually deal anything. Like, there's a lot of 4 toughness units. 3 toughness is just too low. Or 3 power is just too low to actually deal with some of the ground units that you're maybe wanting to stall out. So for all those reasons, Akbar going to have to remain in the C tier for me. Next up, we've got Kazuda Xiono. Kazuda Xiono. This guy is interesting. It's very interesting. He's got this action to make some of the cards that are in your Cunning Heroism deck better. But on the other side, his action does nothing if you don't have those specific cards. So the best one is Millennium Falcon, and we've talked about that a lot. Millennium Falcon, it comes down, you don't have to pay the extra resource every single turn. So you just basically get a 3/4 space unit with an extra 3 damage, right? That's what it is, because you get to immediately rate up. But you are forced to use Kazuda's action every single turn on the Millennium Falcon. There's not that many other units that work specifically with Kazuda. There's some bounty cards like Cartel Turncoat. You have things like the Fireball, which is a new card. So you have a couple of interesting ones that work specifically with this guy. This is one of those ones where I could definitely see them printing cards specifically with downsides that this guy gets to take advantage of. One of the other cards that I thought of was the new card that was revealed that gets defeated at the start of the regroup phase, I believe. That's the 4/4 Ambusher for 3. The problem is that you kind of want to be in space and you don't really want to be taking up units for these ambushers on the ground, especially since he's a 4 to deploy leader as well. And he is a +3/+3 upgrade like Major Von Rag, which I actually found to be pretty strong, right? That's like an aggressive situation and it works perfectly with like Millennium Falcon. Here's the other thing though, is you also get to take an extra action every single time you use Kazuda's action. So that's really important because if you had to use up an action and you only got the fact that you remove your downsides on your units, it would be horrible because you're using way too many actions, giving up an initiative so many different times. But the fact that you don't give up initiative with Kazuda, I actually find he's probably... I actually put him better than Rostiku. I'm sorry, Rostiku. You're going to go into the C tier. Better than Akbar still, but I actually have had more success with Kazuda. Literally just removing the Millennium Falcon downside has been good enough. That's good enough. The card's so insane already. The +3/+3 is aggressive enough. I've played like double Cunning Kazuda, which is pretty interesting. Definitely the tempo version with getting extra stats with Kazuda early on is really nice. So I played double Cunning. I've also played Cunning Aggression, which I also think is pretty good, as we've talked about a lot with like Wedge, with, you know, having the Cunning cards, and then things like Luke Cunning or Podameron Cunning. You have like the Millennium Falcon plus Pilot synergies. Like there's a lot of things to be said, but double Cunning, Cunning Aggression, something like that is really strong with Kazuda. And then we've got the last one, the other starter deck. We've got Han Solo. D tier. Oh my gosh, guys. I've played against a lot of Han Solos, and either he does nothing the whole game, like you don't get the +1/+0 from Han because the action needs to have that, or they're so heavily indexed into odd cost that the curve is just terrible. Just terrible. And that's pretty important, especially with a lot of the pilots. Depends on what you're playing with Han, but like if you're playing, let's say, double Cunning Han, you're going to want to be playing Surprise Strike. You're going to want to be playing Cunning. You're going to want to be playing a lot of these good cards that are already not the odd cost cards that you're looking for. And if you're playing like Cunning Aggression, you have A-Wings, Y-Wings that you want to play. There's just cards that you can't really be just playing pure odd costs. And then the flip side, and I think a lot of people forget this, but you have to deploy them as an upgrade to get the resource reset. And that can be decent. 5 to deploy, 3, 4 isn't bad as an upgrade. That's totally fine. And then you can potentially, get, 2 to 3 resources if you are indexing towards that odd cost. Millennium Falcon is in his Cunning colors. Yes, you can get like 2 resources back, 3 resources back. But the question I have for you is, are those 2 to 3 resources on that turn only, assuming you're even able to deploy him as an upgrade, worth not getting anything else from Han? No, I wouldn't say so. And that's the problem with Han. The thing with Boba Fett that made him so strong is every single turn you were getting something good, right? Every single turn you were getting extra resources and you can potentially leverage those. And you were getting the 3 extra resources almost guaranteed with Boba Fett. And you get a 4/7 body that doesn't require you to do anything else but just play Boba Fett, right? Han needs something to be piloted onto and needs other odd costs to be able to get those resources reset. So all of that to say, I just think Han is pretty bad. I've not seen a ton of strength from Han. Maybe there's some sort of deck that I'm missing where when you deploy him, you just reset and that can be an insane turn. Absolutely, I could see that happening. So maybe you could argue, at least right now, like a C tier, but that's where I'd put him. Sorry. But that's where I have all of the set 4 leaders. I think the biggest thing is Pietz. A lot of people have been talking about him. A lot of people have been playing him. I think it's a really strong deck. I just think a lot of people aren't quite there on how to actually play Piet. It's a little bit of a weird deck. I think that it's got a lot of potential. and you have to really, really rely on just some specific cards. Like you really have to play to your wins, not play to not lose with Piet. So I think that's something that people will start to pick up on as more players are playing Piet and just see the deck in action. Every other list in the A and S tier, Wedge, Luke, Vonreg, Poe, Boa, are all pilot slash space based decks that oftentimes are just aggroing you out really, really quickly. Luke, I suppose, might be the exception on that one. And Boba Fett is a little bit more mid-rangey because they deploy a little bit later, whereas the other three deploy a lot earlier. Luke does like to get to that 6 resources and end the game then. Same with Boba Fett, but they will end the game then, and it's very quick still. The other ones in B, C, and D, I think C and D tier, I think most people would be expecting that. I think there's some people that argue for Trench and some people that would argue for Han Solo. And if you want to say they're C or even low B tier, I think that's reasonable. These cards are pretty closely together. And if this was on like a major leader tier list, I would definitely put them near the bottom anyways, like still in C or D tier. So it's not like they're raising up there, but in comparison to the other set 4 leaders, I could see that. The B tier, I think there's the most surprising ones there. Like Thrawn has the most potential out of any leader on this list. Kazuda, I wouldn't have expected just like minor synergies to be so powerful, but they really, really are. Rio, that one was definitely a little bit surprising for me, and so was Asajj. Honestly, Asajj just kind of doing that Target Town nonsense and getting these regular pings out. It's just been really strong. But let me know what your experience has been. I know everyone's going to disagree with me. I know people are going to get mad at me. And I know I'm going to move on and let you all know the same thing I have been, which is this was for fun. These are all my opinions. And even though I say you could argue this, you could argue that, you could say this, you could say that, at the end of the day, I'm guaranteed to be wrong about some of these and probably most of these in terms of just like minor changes. That's just how it is. We don't know what these look like in the larger context of the planetary qualifier meta, and that will only come with time. So this is just what I've seen in terms of potential out of the early impressions set 4. Let me know what you think. If you disagree with anything, please let me know in the comments, because I am still testing out things all the time. And so if you have something cool that you want to share, like, dude, have you tried the Lando mono 2-drop deck or whatever? I don't know, something silly like that. Let me know in the comment section down below, and I'll see you all for the next one.